Paris, 1921. The city was cloaked in fog and whispers, the gas lamps flickering along cobblestone streets as if warning those who dared to wander too close to the theater on Montmartre. Inside, a magician named Lucien Moreau prepared for a performance that no one would ever forget, a show rumored to stretch the boundaries of reality and sanity. Word had spread through hushed conversations that spectators had vanished from his previous acts, swallowed by shadows, never to be seen again. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back slowly, revealing a stage drenched in dim candlelight, the flickering flames casting restless shadows that danced across the faces of an anxious audience. Lucien's pale eyes glimmered under the theater lights, a strange smile tugging at his thin lips, hinting at secrets too dark for the ordinary world to understand. Every movement of his hands was deliberate, precise, almost inhuman as he manipulated cards, coins, and objects that seemed to defy the natural laws of physics. Gasps escaped quietly from the crowd as shadows bent and twisted in ways that no human mind could explain, the air thick with tension and anticipation. A low hum of whispers filled the theater as rumors of past vanishings permeated the minds of the spectators, yet none dared leave. Curiosity and fear intertwined, binding them to their seats, eyes wide and hearts pounding, fully aware that tonight could claim more than just their attention. Each act unfolded like a nightmare made manifest, shadows curling around Lucien's movements, bending reality with every flick of his fingers. The audience felt an unspoken chill as he summoned illusions that were almost alive, objects floating and dissolving into thin air, yet leaving traces of dread in their wake. Time seemed suspended. The boundary between life and something darker blurred as Lucien's gaze swept over the theater, fixing each person with a cold intensity that left them trembling. His voice, soft and commanding, wove a spell of words that sounded harmless yet carried an unshakable authority, drawing the viewers deeper into the unknown. Every laugh, every startled gasp, every anxious glance between audience members heightened the sense that something far beyond entertainment was taking place. Montmartre's streets outside felt distant, irrelevant, as if the city itself had paused to witness what was unfolding inside those heavy walls. Lucien's performance was meticulous, each movement choreographed to seduce the mind and unsettle the soul, creating a tension so thick it seemed to stick to the air, heavy and suffocating. Patrons leaned forward, unable to resist the magnetic pull of fear and fascination, their minds teetering on the edge of disbelief. Shadows gathered in corners of the theater, creeping closer to those who had dared to sit in the front rows, curling around feet and chairs in almost sentient patterns. The temperature dropped imperceptibly, goosebumps rising on arms as the faint scent of incense mixed with candle wax, a smell both intoxicating and foreboding. A hush fell over the audience as Lucien produced a final act, a display that seemed to consume the very light, leaving only dark, pulsating shadows and the faintest echo of whispered incantations. Hearts raced, palms sweat-soaked as the impossible unfolded before them, each trick bending reality until disbelief and terror became indistinguishable. No one spoke, yet a collective understanding passed silently. Something terrible and permanent might be happening. The boundaries of magic and malevolence had blurred, and every person in the theater sensed the potential for their own existence to vanish into the darkness that clung to Lucien's every gesture. The stage seemed alive, breathing in sync with the audience's rapid heartbeats, shadows shifting with intent and intelligence. Lucien's hands moved like serpents, quick and precise, performing feats that were impossible yet undeniable, leaving faint traces of his presence in the air, tangible as fear itself. Every object that rose and fell, floated and vanished, added to the suffocating tension, a cumulative weight pressing on the minds of the spectators. The atmosphere thickened with each passing moment, shadows elongating, flickering, twisting in unnatural ways that no human eye should perceive. Some audience members tried to avert their gaze, yet they were helpless, magnetically drawn toward the stage by a force they could neither resist nor explain. The theater became a cocoon of dread, a place where reality bent and shadows reigned, where fear was as tangible as the velvet seats beneath trembling hands. Lucien paused, letting the silence stretch, the tension coiling like a snake ready to strike, the entire theater holding its collective breath. The sound of a single coin hitting the stage echoed unnaturally loud, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to devour sound itself. Eyes darted nervously across the room seeking reassurance, finding none. as if the walls themselves had ears and were conspiring in the magician's dark plan. The audience felt the presence of something unseen, a force hovering just beyond perception, tethered to Lucien's will and growing stronger with every motion. Candles flickered violently as a sudden draft swept through, though all doors were locked, windows shut. Murmurs of fear rose briefly, then died as Lucien's piercing gaze silenced them, commanding obedience without words. Shadows deepened, pooling like liquid around the edges of the stage. The theater no longer a place of light but a domain of anticipation and dread. The performers' past vanishing acts seemed to replay in every mind, memories of whispers and rumors filling the air, tangible and suffocating. Each tick of the clock became deafening, marking the slow passage of time in a place where time itself seemed suspended. Lucien's smile widened, knowing the audience's fascination and terror were now fully entwined, inseparable, each spectator caught in a web of fear they could not escape. The first acts had set the stage. Now the true horror was about to unfold, a spectacle that would etch itself permanently into memory, a performance that could claim more than applause. The theater itself seemed to lean inward, shadows closing in, walls stretching and bending subtly, wrapping the audience in an invisible embrace. No sound could escape. No thought could remain untouched as the magician's dark power enveloped the room, tangible, oppressive, and undeniable. A suffocating weight pressed on every chest, the air thick with anticipation and something far more sinister, something that the human mind was never meant to comprehend. Lucien's movements became faster, more precise, a dance of dark elegance, the very fabric of reality bending around him as objects disappeared and reappeared impossibly. Each flick of his wrist, each whisper of words carried a magnetic pull, drawing every eye, every thought, every heartbeat into his control. The audience was entranced, terrified, and powerless, witnessing an event that promised to leave no witness unmarked. Darkness and light wove together like serpents. Shadows clung to corners, fingers of darkness stretching toward every spectator, leaving them chilled to the bone. The stage became a living entity, responding to Lucien's will, bending, twisting, swallowing fragments of reality in a hypnotic rhythm that no one could break. The audience's fear had reached a peak, a silent chorus of pounding hearts and shallow breaths echoing through the theater, each person frozen in the grasp of anticipation and dread. Lucien Moreau moved with a fluidity that seemed almost supernatural, his every gesture calculated to twist perception and bend reality. Shadows clung to him like living entities, responding to his slightest motion, stretching unnaturally across the velvet stage and the anxious faces of the spectators. He produced objects seemingly from thin air, coins and cards that hovered and spun with impossible precision, each movement magnifying the sense of unreality that filled the room. Murmurs rose and fell in waves, whispers of disbelief interlaced with awe, yet a deeper, unspoken terror pulsed beneath the surface of every spectator's mind. Some shifted nervously in their seats, eyes darting toward exits that were now seemingly distant, almost unreachable, as if the theater itself had expanded to contain them. Candlelight flickered violently, casting jagged shadows that danced across the faces and walls, creating illusions within illusions, each more disorienting than the last. Lucien's gaze swept methodically over the crowd, pale eyes reflecting a predatory calm, a silent acknowledgement that each person had willingly stepped into his carefully constructed nightmare. The air thickened, saturated with the scent of wax, incense, and an indefinable tang of something darker, something primal that whispered of vanished souls and broken realities. The stage itself seemed alive, responding to the magician's intent, surfaces flexing subtly as if breathing, warping perception with minute, deliberate distortions. Each trick escalated the tension, a crescendo of impossible feats and calculated terror, leading the audience to the precipice of their comprehension and sanity. Coins spun and hung in midair, shadows elongated unnaturally, and objects folded and reappeared in ways that defied physics. Each demonstration a quiet assertion that reality was now subject to Lucien's will. Eyes widened in terror and wonder, pupils dilating as the mind struggled to reconcile what was seen with what was believed possible. The temperature dropped perceptibly, goosebumps rising across exposed skin as an almost imperceptible vibration seemed to pass through the theater, a pulse of energy emanating from the magician himself. Lucien's movements became faster, sharper, each gesture more mesmerizing than the last. The audience caught in a trance-like state, unable to look away, unable to speak, unable to resist. Whispers of vanished spectators' past echoed faintly in the imagination, feeding paranoia and compounding the sense of imminent peril. Every flicker of light, every subtle movement of shadow seemed to hint at unseen forces waiting just beyond comprehension, ready to intervene or consume. The tension was unbearable, a tangible weight pressing against the mind and chest of each attendee, creating a collective consciousness steeped in awe and terror. Lucian's performance transcended mere entertainment. It was a ritual, a dark choreography designed to entrap perception and redefine reality within the theater's walls. Time slowed, each heartbeat elongated, each breath drawn like a physical tether to the stage, anchoring the audience to the magician's will. Coins defied gravity, cards flew in intricate arcs, and shadows danced independently, moving in ways that no human could have orchestrated. Some spectators closed their eyes, unwilling to witness what was happening. Yet they could not escape the sense that their very essence was being observed, analyzed, manipulated by Lucien's dark mastery. The theater's architecture seemed to shift subtly, corners lengthening, walls bending imperceptibly, reinforcing the idea that nothing in this space adhered to the natural order. A soft, almost inaudible hum seemed to resonate from the stage, vibrating through the floor, the chairs, and even the bodies of the spectators, synchronizing with their quickened pulses. Lucian paused momentarily, letting the silence expand and intensify, each second stretching like an eternity, holding the audience in suspense, a perfect predator savoring the heightened awareness of its prey. Then with deliberate slowness he raised his hands, and shadows leapt from the corners to the center of the stage, twisting and contorting as if alive, merging and splitting in patterns that defied comprehension. The spectators' eyes followed every motion, minds struggling to process the impossible. Yet a part of them thrilled in the horrifying beauty of the performance. Murmurs of disbelief returned, but they were weaker now, swallowed by the oppressive aura of control emanating from Lucian, a force that seemed to bind the audience together in a shared experience of dread and fascination. Every object that disappeared and reappeared left a lingering impression, an invisible mark on the psyche of the viewers, a reminder that reality was mutable, fragile, and subject to the will of a single, enigmatic man. The candlelight flickered one last time, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch beyond the walls, reaching into the minds of the audience, leaving them suspended between wonder and terror. Lucian's smile widened, subtle yet sinister, acknowledging the absolute hold he had over the crowd, each person teetering on the brink of disbelief and horror, utterly captivated. No sound broke the thick atmosphere except the occasional shuffle of an uneasy foot, or the faint inhale of air as spectators struggled to maintain composure. Every movement, every gesture, every whispered word carried weight, drawing the audience deeper into a web of anticipation and fear, from which there was no reprieve. The line between reality and illusion blurred entirely, shadows consuming light, and time itself bending to the rhythm of Lucien's dark performance. By the time the final act of the introduction concluded, the audience was irrevocably ensnared, a captive witness to a magician whose powers seemed limitless, whose control over perception was absolute, and whose dark legacy promised that some might never leave the theater alive in mind or spirit. The atmosphere was electric, thick with tension, suffused with the unspoken knowledge that the true horror was only beginning, that Lucian's grip on reality and the souls before him was only growing stronger, drawing every heart and mind toward the inevitable and the unknown. Paris in 1921 was a city of contrasts, a place where opulence and poverty coexisted, where the laughter of cafes masked the secrets hidden in narrow alleys. Montmartre, the district where Lucien Moreau's theater stood, had long been a hub for artists, performers, and those who thrived on the fringes of society. Gas lamps lined the cobblestones, their flickering light revealing shadowed corners that seemed to whisper ancient secrets, alleys where the air was thick with mystery and the scent of damp stone. Lucien was born into obscurity, a child of a modest family with a fascination for illusion and misdirection that emerged at a young age. As he grew, his talents became extraordinary, mastering sleight of hand, mentalism, and the darker arts whispered about in forbidden circles. Rumors claimed that he had traveled across Europe, learning from reclusive magicians, occult practitioners, and even alchemists who claimed to manipulate the boundaries of reality itself. By the time he established his theater in Paris, Lucien had acquired a reputation both feared and revered, a man capable of bending perception to his will, leaving audiences both awed and unsettled. The theater itself was an old, sprawling building with a history of strange occurrences. Previous owners spoke of unexplained noises, shifting shadows, and patrons who had vanished without trace. Though none dared speak of it openly, Lucien transformed it into a stage perfectly suited to his dark performances, combining elegant architecture with hidden passages, trapdoors, and concealed mechanisms that enhanced the illusion of the supernatural. His staff was small but loyal, drawn by charisma, fear, or promises of arcane knowledge. They handled costumes, props, and lighting with precision, ensuring that each performance unfolded flawlessly, maintaining the air of mystique and danger that surrounded Lucien and his acts. The city buzzed with anticipation whenever a new show was announced. Posters appeared overnight featuring intricate illustrations of a magician whose pale eyes seemed to follow the viewer, whose hands promised wonders and horrors beyond imagination. Tickets were coveted, though rumors of disappearances made many wary, and yet those who attended often did so in secret, driven by curiosity, fascination, or the thrill of confronting the unknown. Lucien's private life remained enigmatic. Few knew where he lived, what he ate, or who he associated with outside the theater. He cultivated a persona that blurred reality and performance, presenting himself as both gentleman and enigma, charming and terrifying in equal measure. Scholars and critics wrote cautiously about his work, often praising his technical skill while hinting at something far darker, a presence in his shows that defied rational explanation. They spoke of fleeting glimpses of shadows that moved independently, objects that defied gravity, and the faintest traces of whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, unsettling the most skeptical attendees. Parisian newspapers occasionally ran stories on missing patrons, but no concrete evidence linked these disappearances directly to Lucien, allowing his legend to grow unchecked. Street vendors and locals contributed to the folklore, spinning tales of a magician who could command shadows, summon specters, and bend the human mind to his will. A man who could make the impossible terrifyingly real. The theater's location was strategic, tucked away on a narrow street that forced audiences to approach cautiously, heightening the sense of suspense before the show even began. Gas lamps flickered as patrons approached, shadows stretching long and distorted across the cobblestones, echoing the tales they had heard and the fears they carried. Lucien's performances were never repeated. Each show was unique, deliberately crafted to surpass the previous act, leaving the audience disoriented and enthralled. This constant evolution created an aura of unpredictability, feeding the rumors and ensuring that no one could fully prepare for what they would witness. Musicians, stagehands, and assistants were meticulously trained to maintain the illusion of control. Yet even they were rumored to be under Lucien's mysterious influence, compelled to follow instructions that defied logic or morality. Historical context added another layer of unease. Paris had emerged from the Great War, a city scarred by loss and upheaval, where shadows of the past mingled with the fragile hopes of recovery. People craved distraction, wonder, and excitement, yet many carried a latent fear of the unknown, of forces beyond comprehension, making Lucien's dark performances both alluring and terrifying. Intellectuals and occultists alike visited his theater, some to observe, some to participate, each leaving with a story that blurred the lines between reality and illusion, truth and legend. Lucien's manipulation of perception, combined with the theater's hidden architecture and carefully orchestrated lighting, created experiences that were impossible to forget, embedding themselves into the minds of those who witnessed them. Every detail, from the placement of chairs to the angles of mirrors and the timing of candle flickers, was calibrated to maximize psychological impact, ensuring that each act resonated long after the audience left. Scholars attempting to document his techniques often found themselves confounded, unable to reconcile what they observed with known principles of physics and psychology. The city itself seemed to acknowledge his influence, with the streets around Montmartre quieting as shows commenced, a hushed reverence or fear spreading among those who could see the theater from afar. Lucien's reputation was not merely a product of skill. It was amplified by myth, rumor, and the collective imagination of a city teetering between fascination and terror. This combination of talent, environment, and legend created an atmosphere in which the magician's performances became legendary, a mixture of artistry and dread that would haunt Paris for years to come. Patrons entered the theater willingly, yet the weight of expectation, the thrill of danger, and the subtle manipulation of reality ensured that each experience left an indelible mark. It was here, amidst shadows, flickering light, and whispered rumors, that Lucien Moreau's dark art reached its peak, creating an enduring legacy of fear, fascination, and the ever-present possibility of disappearance. The details of Lucien Moreau's rise to notoriety were as shrouded in mystery as the alleys of Montmartre itself, a combination of talent, obsession, and perhaps forces beyond understanding. Childhood accounts described a boy fascinated by sleight of hand and the manipulation of perception, spending hours practicing illusions with anything he could find, from coins to playing cards. Driven by an insatiable curiosity that bordered on compulsion, he learned quickly that people's eyes and minds could be deceived, that attention could be diverted and belief manipulated, and he refined these skills with a meticulous dedication few could rival. As he matured, his fascination with the macabre became more pronounced, reading forbidden texts and exploring occult knowledge whispered about in secret circles. Some claimed he had apprenticed with enigmatic figures across Europe, magicians, alchemists, and even occult practitioners who promised insights into bending reality itself. Whether these stories were true or part of the legend, they contributed to the aura of dread and fascination that surrounded him. By 1921, Lucien's performances had acquired a reputation that transcended ordinary entertainment. Patrons whispered about acts that seemed alive, illusions that lingered in the mind long after the show ended, and shadows that moved with intentionality, independent of the performers. The theater's architecture amplified the sensation, with hidden passages, trapdoors, and mirrors strategically placed to disorient and manipulate perception. Lucien's staff, carefully selected and trained, ensured every detail of the performance adhered to his exacting standards. Their loyalty was a mixture of fear, admiration, and perhaps enchantment, as even they seemed caught in the magnetic pull of Lucien's presence. The city of Paris, still recovering from the Great War, offered a fertile ground for such legend. Its streets were filled with people hungry for distraction, for wonder, for experiences that momentarily transported them from the harsh realities of life. Montmartre's winding streets and shadowed corners added to the theater's mystique, each alley a prelude to the tension and terror waiting inside. Lucien's private life was almost entirely concealed, a deliberate construction to enhance the legend. Few knew his residence, daily habits, or companions outside the theater, and any attempts to investigate were met with polite dismissal or eerie silence. Critics and intellectuals speculated endlessly, praising the technical mastery while hinting at supernatural involvement, noting the unexplainable occurrences that seemed to defy reason. Patrons reported fleeting glimpses of shadows that appeared alive, objects defying gravity, and whispers that had no source, creating a psychological tension as powerful as any visual trick. The repeated rumors of vanished audience members only enhanced the allure, creating an irresistible pull for those seeking the thrill of confronting the unknown. Posters advertising his shows became works of art in themselves, depicting Lucien with a gaze that seemed to penetrate the viewer, hands poised to manipulate more than just cards and coins, promising experiences that were both mesmerizing and terrifying. Each performance was unique, crafted meticulously to surpass the previous show, ensuring unpredictability and maintaining the audience's captivation. Musicians, stagehands, and assistants executed precise timing, cues, and effects that made the impossible appear effortless, while simultaneously sustaining an undercurrent of danger and uncertainty. Lucien's mastery of lighting, shadows, and sound created a theater environment that seemed alive, breathing in tandem with the audience's reactions, each element carefully calibrated to maximize tension. Historical context further amplified the impact. Paris was a city in transition, recovering from war, a populace scarred by trauma yet craving distraction and spectacle, a perfect stage for a performer capable of bending perception and instilling awe. The combination of real skill, theatrical design, and psychological manipulation rendered Lucien's acts unforgettable, embedding themselves in the memories of those who witnessed them. Even academics attempting to document the mechanics were confounded, unable to reconcile observed phenomena with conventional principles of physics or psychology, reinforcing the aura of supernatural influence. Streets around Montmartre fell silent on performance nights, a subtle acknowledgement of the unspoken power held within the theater walls. The blend of legend, rumor, and reality created a potent environment where anticipation and fear coalesced into a tangible force, pulling patrons into a web from which few left unchanged. Lucien's reputation was thus a carefully maintained construct, a combination of skill, myth, and psychological dominance that ensured the legend would endure. Patrons were drawn by the promise of wonder, entertained by impossible feats, yet subtly reminded that danger lurked within each act, that the boundary between observer and participant, reality and illusion, was dangerously thin. Every act, every gesture, every element of the stage was meticulously designed to evoke a precise emotional response, a mixture of awe, fear, and helpless fascination. By the time one left the theater, the memory of Lucien's performance lingered, a haunting impression of skill and darkness intertwined, leaving the audience both exhilarated and unsettled. His influence extended beyond the stage, as stories, rumors, and whispered accounts spread through Paris, contributing to a citywide aura of fascination and terror. This combination of talent, environment, and legend made Lucien Moreau an almost mythical figure, a man whose dark artistry would continue to captivate and haunt the imaginations of all who encountered his name. The theater became not just a venue, but a symbol of the unknown, a place where perception, reality, and fear intertwined, and where Lucien's control over both the environment and the audience reached its apex. Patrons, staff, and onlookers alike became part of a legend that would endure for generations, their experiences shaping the stories and rumors that amplified Lucien's infamy, creating a perfect storm of skill, fear, and fascination that defined Parisian culture in the early 1920s. The nights leading up to Lucien Moreau's most infamous performance were filled with a sense of anticipation that seemed almost tangible in the Parisian air, a mixture of curiosity, fear, and the thrill of witnessing something extraordinary. Rumors had circulated for weeks that this show would surpass all others, that Lucien had discovered a new method of vanishing, one that no audience member had ever survived intact. The streets around Montmartre buzzed quietly with speculation. Whispers carried from cafe to cafe, from artist studios to hidden taverns, as the city collectively held its breath for the spectacle. Patrons arrived days in advance, securing seats through secretive ticket brokers who demanded exorbitant sums, their methods adding to the sense of exclusivity and danger. Stories of previous disappearances fueled an almost obsessive fascination. Those who had attended earlier performances were reluctant to speak, but often left with a vacant, haunted look, eyes shadowed by the memory of what they had seen. Lucien's posters were everywhere, dark and ominous, depicting his pale face with hands poised as if controlling unseen forces, his eyes promising a journey beyond imagination, into realms where the rules of reality no longer applied. Artists and writers speculated endlessly, some convinced that Lucien had tapped into forces beyond comprehension, others dismissing it as clever manipulation, but all were compelled to attend, drawn by a magnetism they could not resist. In the days leading up to the performance, the theater itself became a place of subtle chaos and meticulous preparation, a paradoxical combination that heightened the suspense. Stagehands whispered among themselves, their voices tense, for even they were aware of the growing fear that permeated the building. Candles were positioned, mirrors adjusted, trapdoors examined repeatedly. Every detail was scrutinized, every motion rehearsed to perfection, ensuring that no error could disrupt the illusion or the psychological grip Lucien exerted over his audience. Meanwhile, local newspapers carried vague hints of strange occurrences, missing persons and unexplained shadows in theaters, feeding public curiosity while maintaining the veneer of deniability. Socialites and intellectuals debated the plausibility of Lucien's acts in private salons, their arguments mixing skepticism with terror, knowing that the true experience awaited them within the velvet walls of the theater. Outside Montmartre, whispers spread like wildfire. Patrons passing through the streets reported strange lights emanating from the theater windows, shadows that flickered with an almost conscious intent, and a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the cobblestones. Some locals claimed they had seen figures moving unnaturally in the upper windows, Yet anyone attempting to investigate found nothing, as though the theater itself was hiding secrets in plain sight. On the evening of the performance, the streets grew unnaturally quiet, a hush settling over Montmartre, broken only by the distant laughter of children or the occasional clatter of a carriage. Gas lamps flickered as spectators approached, their shadows stretching unnaturally long, merging with the shadows cast by the buildings, creating an eerie prelude to what awaited inside. Those entering the theater found an atmosphere thick with anticipation, a charged energy that seemed almost palpable, the air carrying the faint scent of incense, wax, and something indefinably darker. Patrons exchanged nervous glances, aware that their curiosity had led them to a threshold from which there was no turning back. Lucian's assistants moved silently, preparing props with meticulous precision, their movements choreographed to avoid disrupting the psychological tension that had been cultivated for weeks. The magician himself remained unseen, a shadowed figure behind heavy curtains, his presence already felt though no one had glimpsed him fully. Conversations dwindled to murmurs as the audience settled into their seats, the weight of expectation pressing against them, hearts beating in sync with the unspoken rhythm of suspense. Candlelight flickered across the theater, shadows stretching across faces and walls, creating illusions that seemed almost alive, hints of movement in the corners of vision that forced each observer to question reality. The anticipation was relentless, each second building toward a climax that no one could yet imagine. Every heartbeat a drum, signaling the approach of something both magnificent and terrifying. Patrons whispered stories of those who had vanished in prior shows, their voices low yet carrying a sense of fear and fascination, as though speaking aloud might summon the same fate. Lucian's reputation had grown to mythic proportions, fueled by a combination of skill, rumor, and fear, and now the audience had become a participant in the legend, willingly stepping into a theater where the line between illusion and reality was about to be obliterated. The moments before the curtain rose were electric, every movement of shadows and flickering light synchronized with the building tension, every whisper and sigh adding to the pervasive sense of impending dread. Observers reported an almost tangible sensation, as if the theater itself had become a living entity, breathing in unison with the audience, each shadow a warning, each flicker of candlelight a harbinger of the unknown. Outside the theater, the streets remained silent, a collective acknowledgement that something extraordinary and dangerous was about to occur, that Montmartre itself had been drawn into Lucien Moreau's orbit of illusion and terror. The anticipation reached a fever pitch as the final preparations were made, props aligned, mirrors positioned, and trapdoors secured, every element calibrated to maximize psychological impact. Patrons clutched programs in hands, whispers fading into an uneasy silence, the weight of expectation pressing down like a tangible force, suspending time itself as the final moment before the curtain was ready to descend. Shadows danced across the walls as the curtain quivered, the hum of tension vibrating through every seat and every spectator, ensuring that when Lucien finally appeared, the audience would be fully immersed in a reality they could neither control nor comprehend. Every second, every flicker of light, every breath drawn in that theater contributed to a mounting sense of inevitability, the quiet horror of anticipation that would make the subsequent acts all the more devastating, ensuring that when the magician revealed his full power, the memory of the experience would be permanently etched into every mind present. The air inside Lucien Moreau's theater grew heavier with each passing moment, an almost suffocating tension that settled over the audience like a tangible fog. Patrons shifted in their seats, hearts racing, eyes wide, caught between fascination and an unspoken dread that permeated every corner of the room. The flickering candlelight created shadows that danced unnaturally, stretching and contracting as if alive, bending reality with a subtle, insidious precision. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft rustle of fabric seemed amplified, echoing through the silence, feeding the collective anxiety. Outside, Montmartre's streets were unusually quiet, the faint echo of footsteps disappearing into the fog, as though the city itself had paused, holding its breath in anticipation of the horrors about to unfold. Rumors of previous disappearances haunted the minds of the spectators, a silent chorus of warnings whispered into their consciousness. They spoke of those who had attended prior shows, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies shaking, and then they were gone, vanished without a trace, leaving nothing but empty seats and an unsettling absence. Lucian's assistants moved with inhuman precision, their motions almost imperceptible yet perfectly timed, ensuring that every illusion would unfold flawlessly, maintaining the hypnotic rhythm that kept the audience entranced. Patrons clutched programs and hands alike, exchanging furtive glances, aware that they were about to witness something that defied explanation, something that could alter their perception of reality forever. Shadows gathered in corners, curling around edges of the stage, and at times it seemed that the darkness itself responded to Lucien's unseen commands, pooling and dispersing in a slow, deliberate dance. The murmurs of fear subsided as the audience became collectively hypnotized by the anticipation, a quiet energy binding them in a shared state of anxious expectation. Every candle flicker, every subtle shift of light across the walls enhanced the sensation that the theater itself was alive, breathing, watching, and aware of every heartbeat and breath. Lucien's presence, though still unseen, was palpable, an invisible force that gripped the room and held it in thrall. The whisper of footsteps from the stage, the soft click of mechanisms hidden beneath the floor, the faint rustle of props, all combined to create a sensory tension that was almost unbearable. Patrons began to notice small, inexplicable occurrences, shadows that lingered longer than they should, objects subtly displaced between glances, a feeling of being observed from angles that should have been impossible. Each anomaly heightened their anxiety, blending reality with the magician's artful manipulation, creating a psychological trap from which there was no escape. Lucien's name echoed silently in the minds of all present, a mantra of fear and anticipation, binding the spectators to the unfolding spectacle. Gas lamps outside the theater flickered violently, casting long, distorted shadows into the streets, contributing to the growing aura of unease, as if the city itself recognized the impending danger. Patrons whispered nervously among themselves, their voices low, fleeting, almost drowned by the oppressive energy of the theater. Some tried to rationalize the tension, attributing it to clever staging or the manipulation of light and sound. But deep down, an unshakable sense of foreboding persisted. The magician's reputation had preceded him, a carefully constructed myth of vanishing acts and dark mastery that preyed on the audience's imagination, ensuring that their minds were already primed for terror before the first act began. The room seemed to contract subtly, the walls pressing inward, the shadows deepening, folding around the spectators as though to warn or perhaps to threaten. Every movement of the assistants, every adjustment of lighting, and every subtle cue of sound served to heighten the tension, each action deliberately calculated to manipulate perception and emotion. The anticipation became almost unbearable, a collective psychological pressure building with every heartbeat, every inhaled breath, every subtle flicker of candlelight that cast monstrous forms across the walls. Patrons were drawn into a shared consciousness, their fears, expectations, and curiosity intermingling, creating an invisible web that Lucien would soon exploit to devastating effect. The scent of wax, incense, and an indescribable undertone of something darker permeated the theater, heightening sensory awareness and subtly influencing the mind. Patrons' pupils dilated, their muscles tensed, every nerve ending hyper-aware, as if the very environment was conspiring to ensnare them further into Lucien's design. Shadows twisted in patterns too precise to be natural, light refracted in ways that defied physics, and the very air seemed charged with an electrical tension, vibrating with anticipation. Lucien's unseen presence loomed over the theater like a predator, and each subtle movement in the shadows or shift in temperature served as a reminder that he controlled not only the performance, but the perception of all who dared attend. The boundaries between reality and illusion blurred, each minute detail meticulously orchestrated to ensure that when the magician finally appeared, the audience's minds would be utterly unprepared for what was to come. A hush settled over the theater, thick and suffocating, and for the first time the spectators fully realized that they were participants in something far beyond ordinary entertainment. Each breath seemed synchronized, a collective rhythm of tension that pulsed through the room, binding them together in an invisible grip that Lucien had orchestrated with meticulous precision. The final seconds before the curtain rose were an eternity, a delicate balance of fear and curiosity, the perfect psychological prelude to the climax of anticipation that would forever define the legacy of Lucien Moreau's dark art. Shadows flickered one last time, the air vibrated, and a collective inhalation of anxious breath swept through the audience, setting the stage for the impossible acts and vanishings that would cement his infamy in Parisian legend. The night had reached its zenith, and the theater was an electric crucible of anticipation, shadows stretching across walls and ceilings, swallowing the murmurs of the crowd in their oppressive folds. Every spectator sat frozen, hearts hammering, senses heightened, acutely aware that they were about to witness an event unlike any other, an act of dark mastery that would leave the ordinary laws of reality shattered. Lucien Moreau emerged from the shadows with an almost spectral grace, his pale face illuminated by flickering candlelight, eyes glinting with a predatory intelligence, every motion deliberate, precise, commanding the audience's attention like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of fear. The stage seemed to breathe with him, shadows coiling and stretching in response to his movements, objects hovering unnaturally in midair, defying logic, creating a sensation that the world itself had shifted subtly into another dimension. A hush descended, absolute and suffocating, as Lucien raised his hands, signaling the beginning of his most notorious act, one that had become the stuff of whispered legend across Paris. Objects vanished in impossible sequences, cards, coins, and trinkets dissolving into air and reappearing in places no human mind could anticipate, each vanishing, amplifying the tension and fear gripping the spectators. The audience could feel the magician's control over the environment, the air thick with an unseen force that bent perception, warping sound and sight, making the impossible tangible and immediate. Lucien's assistants moved like shadows themselves, executing hidden mechanisms that amplified the effect, sliding props, adjusting lighting, manipulating mirrors, all with a silent precision that left no margin for error. Each motion of the magician was a study in theatrical horror, a psychological assault meticulously designed to prey on expectation, fear, and awe simultaneously. Patrons were acutely aware of the rumors that haunted the theater, whispers of previous disappearances that had never been explained, of people who had attended Lucien's acts only to vanish without a trace, leaving behind nothing but empty seats and the lingering memory of terror. As the first human subject was selected, a volunteer or perhaps a victim, it became clear that this performance was more than mere illusion. It was an enactment of absolute control, a manipulation of life itself. Shadows pooled around the volunteer's feet, rising in slow, deliberate waves as if alive, stretching unnaturally, coiling like serpents, and reacting to Lucien's subtle gestures. The air vibrated almost electrically, each heartbeat of the spectators syncing with the rhythm of anticipation, a collective tension that made the theater feel alive, sentient, and malignant. Lucien's hands moved with an uncanny precision, performing gestures that summoned and banished objects, bending light and shadow, shaping the perception of the audience with absolute mastery. Gasps escaped involuntarily as the volunteer began to fade, slowly dissolving into the ambient shadows, a process so meticulous and deliberate that every spectator's mind strained to comprehend the impossibility. Some tried to look away. Others leaned forward, compelled to witness the act, unable to resist the pull of the magician's control. The shadows thickened, coalescing into forms that mimicked human shapes, twisting and writhing, responding to Lucien's will, forming a bridge between the tangible and the spectral. Whispers of fear spread silently through the theater, a psychological contagion infecting each mind, amplifying the tension to near unbearable levels. The disappearing act continued, not just with one person, but with several, each vanishing into darkness that seemed to have a life of its own, shadows folding over bodies and absorbing them in a manner that defied all natural law. The audience felt trapped in a temporal distortion, minutes stretching and contracting unpredictably, hearts pounding in a symphony of terror orchestrated by the magician's unseen hand. Candles flickered violently, throwing jagged shapes across walls, amplifying the sense of unreality. Every shadow stretching and contracting as if participating in the act itself. Objects in the theater seemed to respond independently, chairs shifting slightly, programs fluttering to the floor in midair, adding subtle layers of chaos that disoriented and enthralled the crowd. Lucien's expression remained calm, serene even, a stark contrast to the growing hysteria in the theater, a predator amidst prey, guiding each spectator through a carefully calibrated nightmare. The intensity of the performance reached a fever pitch as the last volunteer faded entirely, leaving only an empty space where moments before a living person had stood, a haunting testament to the magician's dominion over perception and reality. Gasps and whispers cascaded through the theater, the reality of the vanishing settling like a weight upon every mind, every breath held tight in fear and disbelief. Shadows curled around the empty stage, lingering in unnatural ways, the faintest suggestion of movement beyond human understanding, confirming the impossibility of what had just occurred. The psychological impact was profound, the combination of skill, environmental manipulation, and terror creating an experience that no one present would ever forget. Patrons' hearts raced uncontrollably, minds oscillating between disbelief, fascination, and sheer terror, unable to process fully what they had witnessed. Lucian's mastery over perception had reached its apex, bending every element, light, shadow, sound, and attention, into an inescapable orchestration of fear. The theater seemed to pulse with energy, shadows responding to every flick of his wrist, objects obeying his subtle commands, creating a reality that existed only within the confines of the performance. Each second was stretched, elongated, each heartbeat synchronized with the tension, drawing the audience deeper into an inexorable psychological trap from which there was no escape. Even those seated far from the stage felt an almost physical pull, a magnetic force tugging at their senses, anchoring them to the impossible events unfolding before them. The culmination of the act left silence thick and suffocating, every eye fixed on Lucien, every mind grappling with the horror and awe of what had transpired. An indelible mark on their memories that would persist for a lifetime. Shadows lingered, objects subtly shifted, and a faint hum filled the theater, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the energy of the performance, a residual echo of the impossible and the terrifying. Patrons were paralyzed, unsure whether to flee, faint, or speak, caught in the aftershock of witnessing acts that had defied every law of nature they had understood. Lucien lowered his hand slowly. The performance concluded for the moment, yet the audience felt the lingering grasp of his influence, a psychic residue that clung to every nerve and synapse, an invisible reminder of the mastery they had just encountered. The stage seemed almost sentient, the shadows still curling as if reluctant to release their prey, the air charged with anticipation that more horrors could follow at any moment. The theater had become a crucible of fear and fascination, a place where reality had been bent, and the audience irrevocably altered, their perceptions, their memories, and their sense of safety forever reshaped by Lucien Moreau's unrelenting command of the impossible. The aftermath of the vanishings unfolded in a tense, almost surreal silence, the theater vibrating with the residual energy of what had transpired. The audience remained frozen, each mind racing to process the impossible, each heart gripped by a fear that seemed to extend beyond the theater walls. Lucien Moreau stood at the center of the stage, pale and immaculate, eyes glinting like shards of glass in candlelight, surveying the crowd with an unsettling calm that only deepened the sense of dread. Shadows clung to him, pooling and twisting unnaturally, responding to his presence as if the darkness itself were an extension of his will. Objects that had vanished earlier began to reappear in sequences so precise yet impossible that the audience questioned the reliability of their own senses. Coins hovered, cards spun mid-air, and props shifted subtly, as if reality were being reconstructed around the magician's intent. The air was thick with anticipation, heavy and almost suffocating, the very atmosphere charged with a psychic tension that mirrored the collective pulse of the audience. Some patrons clutched their seats, unable to look away, while others tried to avert their gaze, instinctively sensing that any attempt to flee would be meaningless, that they were ensnared in a carefully orchestrated spectacle of psychological terror. The vanished individuals remained absent, their disappearance absolute, leaving a void that seemed to expand perceptibly, stretching the minds of those who had witnessed it beyond the limits of comprehension. Lucien's gestures became more fluid, almost ritualistic as he moved through the shadows, manipulating perception with a precision that bordered on supernatural. Mirrors reflected impossibilities, angles warped subtly, and light itself seemed to obey the magician, bending in ways that violated natural law. Whispers arose among the spectators, low and tremulous, of vanished souls and cursed acts, yet their voices were swallowed by the oppressive weight of the theater, the energy of anticipation and fear dominating every thought. The room felt alive, an entity capable of sensing the fear and fascination of every individual, and amplifying both simultaneously. Lucien paused momentarily, letting the silence stretch, each heartbeat of the audience echoing with deafening clarity in the oppressive quiet. Then with a subtle motion, shadows erupted across the stage, curling into humanoid shapes that moved independently, twisting and writhing as if imbued with life, enveloping the vanished forms in a spectral dance. The intensity of the act reached a crescendo as these shadows absorbed the absence of the disappeared, forming a visual manifestation of fear itself, a representation of mortality, control, and the unknowable power Lucian wielded. Patrons gasped, some trembling as the realization settled that the magician's performance had transcended mere illusion, becoming a conduit for forces beyond human comprehension. Every light flicker, every subtle movement, every pulse of shadow reinforced the idea that reality had been bent to his will. The sensation of disorientation grew as objects moved unpredictably. Furniture shifted imperceptibly, and reflections in mirrors contradicted the eyes of the viewers, creating a sense that the very laws of physics were subordinate to the magician's design. The psychological strain on the audience was immense. Each individual caught in a complex web of fear, fascination, and awe, their minds unable to reconcile what they were witnessing with the world outside the theater. Lucian's mastery extended to the manipulation of sound, subtle echoes and whispers threading through the air, heightening tension, feeding the sense that unseen entities lingered at the edges of perception. Candles flickered violently, casting elongated, grotesque shadows that seemed to reach toward the spectators, reinforcing the notion that the magician's influence extended beyond the stage. Every detail of the theater, the placement of props, the angles of mirrors, the timing of each effect was calibrated to maximize psychological impact, ensuring that the audience remained captive, both physically and mentally, to the spectacle. The culmination of the performance was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Shadows converged, vanished patrons remained absent, and Lucian's gestures commanded the attention of every eye, a hypnotic blend of control and artistry. Patrons' minds struggled under the weight of disbelief, their senses assaulted by the impossible, yet fascination compelled them to witness every movement, every shift, every flicker of shadow, cementing the event as an unforgettable psychological imprint. Gasps, tremors, and silent cries punctuated the experience, yet the theater itself remained unmoved, a vessel for the unfolding of Lucian's terrifying mastery. The climax reached its apex as Lucian extended his hands outward, shadows swirling violently, the absent body's energies seemingly coalescing into a spectral presence that filled the stage. Light bent, reflections multiplied, and a subtle vibration passed through the floor, creating a feeling that the theater itself was alive, participating in the act, amplifying fear, awe, and disorientation. Patrons felt a pressure in their chests, as if the boundaries of reality had been compressed, manipulated, controlled by forces far beyond comprehension, guided solely by Lucian's will. Time seemed distorted, seconds elongating into eternities, each heartbeat a resounding drum echoing in the mind, synchronizing the audience into a collective state of suspended disbelief. As the act drew to a close, shadows retreated, objects stabilized, and the absent patrons remained gone, a haunting silence settling across the theater. Lucian lowered his hands slowly, a calm and measured motion that contrasted starkly with the lingering chaos, leaving the audience with a profound, almost physical awareness of the magician's dominion over perception, reality, and fear itself. The final moments were a delicate balance between revelation and restraint, the magician ensuring that the psychological imprint of the act remained indelible, leaving patrons suspended between awe, terror, and the lingering question of what had truly occurred. By the time the curtain fell, the theater was saturated with an atmosphere of reverence and dread, the impossible acts of vanishings and manipulation, embedding themselves permanently in the minds of those present. Lucien Moreau had not merely performed magic, he had reshaped reality, orchestrated fear, and imposed a haunting legacy upon all who had witnessed the climax, a spectacle that would echo through history as a chilling testament to his dark genius. The moments following Lucien Moreau's vanishing act were steeped in a tense, suffocating silence, an oppressive stillness that settled over the theater like a living entity. Patrons remained frozen in their seats, minds spinning, hearts hammering, their senses still struggling to process the impossible they had witnessed. Some dared to move only to halt mid-step, as if the very air itself resisted, pressing upon them with a weight that defied comprehension. Shadows clung unnaturally to the walls and floor, lingering longer than logic allowed, twisting and stretching as though reluctant to release the energy of the vanished. Murmurs began, low and tremulous, the audience attempting to voice their disbelief, to share their shock. Yet their words faltered in the dense, heavy air. Whispers of terror intertwined with awe, a collective recognition that the performance had transcended entertainment and entered the realm of the incomprehensible. Those who had been closest to the vanished subjects described a profound emptiness, an absence that could be felt physically, a void that seemed to suck light and warmth from the surroundings, leaving only a chilling resonance in its wake. Lucian moved among the audience with serene precision, his presence both commanding and terrifying, observing reactions with the detached scrutiny of a predator assessing prey. Shadows followed him, curling at his feet, stretching toward him as if drawn to his very essence, responding to his subtle gestures, amplifying the psychological impact of the aftermath. Patrons' breathing grew uneven, some shallow, some ragged, their minds oscillating between fascination and paralyzing fear, struggling to reconcile the acts they had witnessed with the reality they thought they understood. The theater itself seemed to pulse with residual energy. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of candlelight, every subtle movement of objects echoing the tension of the vanished. Lucian's assistants moved quietly, collecting props, adjusting lighting, maintaining an eerie semblance of order, their own expressions betraying hints of apprehension, aware that they had been part of a performance that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Outside, Montmartre was alive with speculation. Street vendors whispered rumors to passing pedestrians, cafes buzzed with hurried conversations, and the gaslit streets carried an almost palpable tension as news of the vanishings spread through the city like wildfire. Some spoke in hushed tones of curses, dark powers, or the influence of arcane knowledge, while others, more skeptical, dismissed the accounts as clever trickery. Yet none could ignore the chilling impact that lingered in every retelling. Within the theater, some patrons wept silently, their emotions a volatile mixture of relief and horror, while others were struck mute, minds frozen by the sheer impossibility of what they had experienced. Scholars and critics present attempted to rationalize the events, scribbling notes and observations. Yet their analyses felt inadequate, unable to capture the psychological weight and inexplicable phenomena that had unfolded before them. Lucian observed with a calm detachment, aware of the lasting imprint his performance had made on every mind present. The air remained charged, thick with the residual tension of vanished lives and manipulated perception, a lingering presence that refused to dissipate, embedding itself in the consciousness of the audience. Patrons spoke quietly among themselves, their voices tinged with disbelief, recounting each impossible occurrence. Shadows that moved independently, objects that defied gravity, individuals dissolving into nothingness, the subtle orchestration of sound and light that had bound them all into a collective state of hypnotic terror. The vanished audience members were the subject of particular fascination and dread, their absences confirmed yet unexplainable, creating a pervasive sense of unease that would haunt the remaining patrons long after leaving the theater. Historians later documented the event with meticulous care, piecing together accounts and testimonies. Yet even with comprehensive evidence, the vanishings resisted explanation, defying all known principles of physics, psychology, and logic. Rumors began to circulate that Lucian had discovered a means to manipulate not just perception, but existence itself, bending life and absence according to his will, and that the theater was more than a stage. It was a conduit for forces that exceeded human understanding. Patrons left the theater in a daze. The streets outside bathed in the eerie glow of gas lamps, shadows stretching across cobblestones, their own steps hesitant, uncertain, as if reality itself had been subtly altered. Conversations faltered under the weight of shared terror, attempts at laughter and rationalization collapsing into murmurs of disbelief, the city itself feeling the aftershocks of the performance. Some visitors reported lingering sensations of being watched, of shadows trailing their movements, suggesting that the energy from the theater had extended beyond its walls, infiltrating the minds and lives of all who had witnessed Lucien's acts. The psychological impact was profound. Observers spoke of recurring dreams, unsettling flashes of shadowy figures, and an inescapable awareness that the magician's influence persisted long after they had left the theater. Scholars and occultists debated the mechanisms of his control, from psychological manipulation to arcane knowledge, yet no theory fully accounted for the precision, consistency, and sheer impossibility of the vanishings. The theater became a nexus of fear, curiosity, and fascination, a place where reality and illusion had fused into an inseparable experience, leaving a lasting mark on Parisian culture and the collective imagination of those who had attended. Lucien Moreau had not merely performed magic. He had enacted an experience that rewrote the boundaries of expectation, perception, and fear, leaving a haunting legacy that would resonate for decades. Even as the night ended, the echoes of shadows and vanished lives lingered in every whispered retelling, every cautious glance toward dark corners, and every heartbeat that remembered the impossible acts. Patrons were irrevocably changed, their understanding of reality forever altered. The theater's dark energy a permanent scar etched into their consciousness. The aftershocks of Lucien's performance spread across Montmartre and beyond, generating a persistent mythology, the foundation of legends that would endure, whispered and documented, feared and revered, a testament to the mastery of a magician who had bent perception, existence, and terror itself into an unforgettable performance of darkness and control. The echo of Lucien Moreau's performance lingered like a persistent shadow, embedding itself into the minds of every patron who had witnessed the vanishings. Each footstep toward the theater exit felt weighed down by a psychological gravity, a tether to the impossible events that had just unfolded. Patrons spoke in hushed tones, voices trembling with a mixture of awe, fear, and disbelief, recounting shadows that moved with intent, objects that defied gravity, and individuals who had ceased to exist before their eyes. The air outside the theater carried a heavy tension, a residue of the theater's manipulated atmosphere, as if the city itself recognized the lingering influence of Lucien's mastery. Gas lamps flickered violently, casting long, distorted shadows across the cobblestone streets, which seemed to stretch unnaturally, merging with the audience's distorted perceptions and creating an almost surreal passage back to reality. Some patrons paused on the steps, reluctant to leave the theater entirely, their minds trapped between the comfort of the familiar world outside and the terrifying fascination of what they had just experienced. Psychologists and scholars who had been present noted a palpable shift in behavior among the spectators. Hands trembled, speech faltered, and eye movements betrayed an acute hyper-awareness, as if their senses had been fundamentally rewired by the intensity of the performance. Rumors of vanished individuals spread rapidly, their absences confirmed yet unexplained, igniting discussions in salons, cafes, and newspapers, with the city gripped by both curiosity and dread. Those who had attended previous performances spoke cautiously, their expressions haunted, voices lowered, revealing details of vanishings and unexplained occurrences that seemed to defy every rational explanation. Lucien Moreau's reputation swelled beyond the confines of Montmartre, reaching intellectual circles and social elites, who debated the plausibility of supernatural involvement, occult knowledge, or advanced psychological manipulation, each theory insufficient to account for the precision and consistency of the disappearances. The vanished were not merely missing. They had become specters in the collective memory of Paris, their absence both a psychological and spatial void that reinforced the terrifying mastery of the magician. Within the theater, assistants and stagehands moved with deliberate care, dismantling the set while preserving the aura of the act, ensuring that the energy of the vanishings remained suspended in the walls, shadows, and corners, an indelible reminder of what had transpired. Patrons described lingering feelings of being observed, subtle movements in peripheral vision, and shadows that seemed to mimic or respond to their actions, a persistent psychological imprint that suggested Lucien's influence extended beyond the physical performance. Scholars and occultists who analyzed the night's events noted a recurring pattern. The manipulation of perception, combined with precise timing, environmental control, and psychological conditioning, created an experience that was indistinguishable from reality, effectively erasing the boundary between illusion and existence. Conversations in cafes and private salons became fevered debates, attempts to rationalize or explain the disappearances colliding with a pervasive acknowledgement that some forces, whether psychological or supernatural, had been at work. Patrons described a lingering chill, an ineffable sense of absence, and an almost physical pull that drew their attention back toward the theater long after they had left. Reinforcing the permanence of the experience, the streets of Montmartre remained quiet in the early hours, a strange calm overlaying the city, as if it too had been affected by the psychological tremors of the performance. Citizens spoke in whispers of strange lights, fleeting shadows, and an unshakable feeling that the vanished were not entirely gone, but somehow tethered to the theater, their existence suspended in a liminal space curated by Lucien's manipulation. Within the theater, the remnants of the act, The displaced props, subtle shifts in lighting and residual scents of wax incense, and a darker, undefinable presence served as a tangible reminder of the performance, a physical imprint of events that had transcended the boundaries of ordinary experience. Patrons' minds replayed sequences endlessly, analyzing every gesture, every flicker of shadow, every impossible disappearance, each detail reinforcing the terrifying brilliance of Lucian's control. Accounts of the vanished and lingering shadows became central to the mythology surrounding Moreau, inspiring stories, warnings, and even attempts at replication by magicians and occultists, none of which succeeded in recreating the psychological precision of the original performance. Psychologists would later classify the event as a masterclass in mass perception manipulation, yet the disappearances themselves remained inexplicable, a haunting reminder that Lucien had orchestrated not just an illusion, but a profound alteration of reality within the theater's walls. Patrons reported sleepless nights, recurring dreams of shadows and vanishings, and a persistent awareness that Lucian's influence had permeated their consciousness, leaving an indelible scar that no amount of rationalization could erase. The vanishings themselves became a focal point of urban legend, a tale whispered in Montmartre's cafes and studied in hushed academic discussions, the magician's name evoking both fear and awe, his acts analyzed, dissected, and mythologized yet never fully understood. Even months later, the psychological residue remained. Visitors to the theater found themselves trembling in anticipation, aware that the space itself retained a connection to the vanished, a tether between reality and the impossibly manipulated events of that night. Scholars and investigators noted subtle changes in the architecture, objects imperceptibly shifted, and shadows lingering in unnatural ways, evidence that Lucian's mastery had imposed a lasting mark upon the theater, a permanent conduit of his terrifying influence. Patrons, critics, and historians agreed that Lucien Moreau had not merely performed magic. He had engineered an experience that manipulated perception, emotion, and reality itself, leaving a haunting imprint on all who had been present. The aftershocks of the performance extended far beyond the theater, shaping the narrative of Parisian culture, instilling a fascination and fear that would resonate across generations, cementing Lucien's legacy as a magician whose control over mind and matter defied explanation. The vanished remained central to this narrative, a chilling reminder of the cost of curiosity and the absolute dominion wielded by Lucien, a figure whose mastery of the impossible had forever altered the boundaries between entertainment, fear, and reality. Even after the audience had departed, an air of enigma clung to Lucien Moreau's theater, a lingering presence that defied reason and explanation. Shadows twisted unnaturally along the walls, curling and stretching as if alive, and a subtle vibration lingered in the floorboards, an almost imperceptible hum that resonated through the space like a heartbeat. Scholars, occultists, and witnesses alike attempted to analyze the events, yet every observation seemed inadequate to capture the full scope of what had occurred. The vanishings were absolute. Individuals who had attended the performance simply ceased to exist, leaving no trace, no physical residue, nothing to indicate where or how they had gone. Attempts to rationalize the phenomena through conventional physics or psychological manipulation failed. Even the most elaborate theories fell short when confronted with the precision and consistency of the disappearances. Lucien Moreau's methods remained shrouded in secrecy, speculation fueled by the impossibility of the acts he had performed. Some suggested advanced psychological conditioning, a manipulation of perception so refined that the audience experienced the vanishing as reality itself. Others whispered of occult intervention, invoking forbidden knowledge, rituals, or even contact with otherworldly forces that granted the magician dominion over existence itself. Every investigation led to more questions than answers, the theater itself becoming a locus of fear and fascination, a physical and metaphysical space where reality had been bent and warped beyond recognition. Witnesses reported recurring sensations of being watched, shadows that seemed to move independently, and fleeting glimpses of figures in peripheral vision, all of which suggested that the effects of the performance extended beyond the immediate temporal and spatial boundaries of the theater. Historians documented these accounts meticulously, noting a pattern. Those who had attended the performance were forever changed, their perceptions altered, their consciousness marked by a lingering awareness of the vanished. Attempts to replicate the act were met with failure. No other magician, illusionist, or psychologist could achieve the same level of control over reality and perception. Some scholars posited that Lucian had discovered a method to manipulate probability, to shift the fundamental parameters of existence within a contained environment. Others theorized that the theater itself had been transformed into a conduit, a locus where physical and metaphysical laws intersected, allowing the magician to exert influence over matter and consciousness alike. The vanished individuals remained central to the mystery, a chilling enigma that fueled both fear and fascination. Accounts described their absences not as simple disappearance, but as an extraction of presence, a removal from the perceptible world that left behind an emotional and spatial void. Attempts to track or locate them through conventional means yielded nothing. The vanished were, for all intents and purposes, erased from reality. Witnesses described an almost visceral memory of the absent, a sensation of lacking that persisted long after leaving the theater. Some reported dreams in which the vanished were present, shadows reaching out from impossibly distant spaces, voices whispering incomprehensible words that echoed in the subconscious. The city itself seemed to respond to the phenomenon, with Montmartre streets maintaining an uncanny stillness, shadows stretching unnaturally, and a subtle distortion in perception that even casual observers noticed. Scholars debated whether the vanished had entered another dimension, been absorbed into a psychic construct, or succumbed to forces entirely beyond human understanding. Occultists speculated on connections to ancient practices, invoking arcane texts that described the manipulation of essence, the removal of presence from one plane to another. Yet none could prove the mechanics of such acts. Physicists, psychologists, and magicians alike attempted experimental recreations, all failing to reproduce even the simplest effects of Lucian's performance. Theories ranged from advanced optical illusions and hypnotic suggestion to metaphysical manipulation, yet none accounted for the absolute disappearance of the volunteers. Patrons continued to report lingering psychological effects, persistent shadows, distorted perceptions of space, and the haunting sensation that the vanished were somehow still present, their absence more tangible than existence. Scholars noted that these effects were most pronounced near the theater itself, suggesting that the location acted as a focal point, a conduit for forces that continued to operate beyond the performance. Discussions of Lucian's methods shifted from mere performance art to the realms of forbidden knowledge, psychological domination, and paranormal influence. Folklore developed quickly, as stories of the vanished circulated in hushed tones, embellishing the magician's legend with every retelling. The vanished became more than individuals. They were symbols of the limits of human understanding, a warning of the potential for perception and reality to be manipulated by forces beyond comprehension. Shadows were described as almost sentient, responding to thoughts and movements, creating a pervasive sense that the theater itself was alive, that it held the residual energy of the vanished, and that this energy could influence minds and perceptions long after the audience had departed. Attempts to enter the theater for investigation were often met with an uneasy pressure, a psychic weight that forced hesitation, as if the building itself rejected intrusion, preserving the secrets of Lucian's acts. Even decades later, accounts persisted of strange phenomena, fleeting glimpses of figures in abandoned seats, objects moving without explanation, and an eerie tension that hung in the air, a constant reminder of the vanished and the impossible control wielded by the magician. The mystery of Lucien Moreau endured because it combined elements of the tangible, the psychological, and the unexplainable, blending reality and illusion into a singular, haunting experience. The vanishings, shadows, and altered perceptions created a permanent legacy, one that defied analysis, resisted explanation, and continued to captivate and terrify all who encountered it. Montmartre itself seemed to exist under the subtle shadow of his mastery, a district where light, perception, and reality remained in delicate, uneasy balance, forever influenced by the events that had transpired within the theater's walls. Every retelling, every whispered account, reinforced the unresolvable nature of the mystery, ensuring that Lucien Moreau's legacy endured not merely as a performance, but as a profound and chilling enigma of human perception, fear, and the manipulation of reality itself. The enigma surrounding Lucien Moreau deepened with each passing day, the vanishings continuing to haunt not only those who had witnessed them, but also the city itself. Patrons described shadows that lingered in hallways long after departure, faint whispers echoing in empty rooms, and fleeting figures glimpsed in mirrors that reflected impossible images. Investigators attempted to chart patterns, to map the occurrences. Yet every approach yielded only contradictions, the events resisting classification, logic, and the very principles of causality. The vanished were remembered not only in the minds of the audience but also in the physical absence they left behind. Empty seats, spaces in photographs, and an undeniable psychological void that seemed to absorb attention and thought alike. Lucian's methods remained an impenetrable mystery, a fusion of psychological mastery, environmental manipulation, and seemingly supernatural control that defied every attempt at understanding. Some theorists suggested that he had discovered a technique to manipulate consciousness itself, a means to extract perception and presence from one plane of reality to another, leaving no trace, no evidence, only an unfillable absence. The shadows, described by witnesses as responsive and aware, seemed to act independently, coalescing around the vanished, hinting at a lingering connection between the magician's will and the disappeared. Scholars speculated that the theater functioned as a nexus, a conduit in which physical and metaphysical laws intersected, amplifying the effects of Lucian's mastery. Attempts to document residual energy within the theater often produced inexplicable readings, fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, cold spots that defied explanation, and subtle distortions in light and sound that reinforced the perception of a lingering presence. Patrons who returned to the theater for observation reported heightened anxiety, feelings of being observed, and glimpses of movement in peripheral vision, all suggesting that the vanished were in some way tethered to the space, a haunting reminder that their absence was not total. Lucien Moreau's influence extended beyond those physically present, as stories of the vanishing spread throughout Paris and beyond, shaping cultural perceptions of magic, fear, and the supernatural. Rumors proliferated that he had delved into forbidden knowledge, ancient texts, and arcane practices that granted him control over reality itself. Yet none could verify the truth of these claims, leaving a veil of speculation as thick and impenetrable as the shadows he manipulated. Some witnesses reported recurring dreams in which they confronted the vanished, shadowy forms whispering unintelligible messages, a persistent psychological echo that left them questioning the boundary between reality and memory. The vanished became symbols of the limits of human comprehension, embodiments of the fragile barrier between perception and actuality, their absence a warning of the dangers inherent in curiosity and exposure to forces beyond understanding. Investigators noted that all attempts to reproduce the acts failed, regardless of skill, knowledge, or intent, underscoring the uniqueness of Lucian's mastery and the impossibility of replication. The theater itself was a character in this unfolding mystery, a vessel for the magician's manipulation, imbued with a residual presence that seemed to respond to attention, emotion, and thought, amplifying fear and fascination simultaneously. Patrons who visited years later described the lingering aura of the vanished, the oppressive weight of expectation, and the subtle suggestion of movement in corners that should have remained still, reinforcing the notion that the magician's influence persisted indefinitely. Folklore and legend intertwined with factual accounts, creating a narrative in which the vanished were central figures, shadows acting as intermediaries, and Lucian himself as an agent of forces unknown. Some theorists posited multidimensional explanations, suggesting that the vanished were shifted into parallel realities or suspended states, their existence preserved but inaccessible, while shadows acted as conduits, bridging the perceivable and the imperceptible. The persistent psychological effects on witnesses indicated a deep-seated manipulation of cognition, memory, and perception, demonstrating that the act's impact extended far beyond the theater, embedding itself into consciousness, culture, and urban mythology. Scholars, magicians, and occultists continued to debate and study the phenomenon, each failing to reconcile the tangible and intangible elements, the consistent precision of vanishings, and the inexplicable behavior of shadows that seemed aware, intelligent, and responsive. Even decades later, Montmartre bore subtle signs of the events, with residents reporting strange sensations, fleeting images, and an atmosphere that could only be described as heavy with the memory of Lucian's mastery. The vanished remained central to every discussion, their absence a persistent enigma, their existence questioned and theorized but never verified. Each retelling, each whispered account, further embedded the mystery into cultural memory, ensuring that Lucien Moreau's influence endured long past the performance, a permanent scar on the perception of reality itself. Patrons and scholars alike came to realize that the vanished were not merely missing. They existed in a liminal state, bound to the theater, shadows, and memory, a haunting testament to the magician's absolute dominion over perception and existence. The theater, the shadows, and the stories combined into a complex, self-sustaining enigma, a living narrative in which reality, fear, and psychological manipulation intertwined, resisting all attempts at explanation. Lucien Moreau's legend persisted as an enduring study in the manipulation of human perception, the boundaries of reality, and the terrifying possibility that some individuals could bend existence itself to their will. The vanished, the shadows, and the residual presence of the magician became a permanent fixture in both folklore and academic inquiry, a reminder of the fragile nature of understanding, the unknowable potential of human perception, and the lingering impact of one man's mastery over both reality and imagination. Montmartre itself seemed to bear the weight of these mysteries, shadows stretching long into alleyways, whispers of vanished forms echoing through streets, and a subtle tension in the air that ensured Lucien Moreau's presence. And the haunting mystery he created would never be forgotten. The echoes of Lucien Moreau's performance lingered in Montmartre long after the theater emptied, a spectral presence embedded into the minds of every patron, every witness, every whispering soul who had glimpsed the impossible. The vanished continued to haunt the edges of consciousness, their absence felt in subtle ways: empty chairs, the subtle displacement of objects and shadows that moved independently, twisting unnaturally in corners and hallways. Scholars, psychologists, and occultists alike documented these residual effects, yet none could fully explain the persistent influence, the way fear and fascination intertwined into a tangible, almost physical presence that followed visitors long after they left the theater. Lucien Moreau himself remained an enigma, a figure whose mastery of perception, reality, and psychological manipulation transcended the limits of human understanding. Some claimed that he had discovered a means to bend reality itself, extracting the essence of those who dared to participate, leaving behind only the ghostly remnants of what had once been. The vanished became symbols, warnings etched into collective memory, a chilling testament to the power of human curiosity and the consequences of witnessing forces beyond comprehension. Patrons recounted dreams in which shadows formed humanoid figures, their movements deliberate, stalking through the subconscious, reenacting the impossible acts of the magician, and leaving observers to awaken in a cold sweat. The lines between memory and reality blurred. The theater itself, though physically intact, seemed imbued with a lingering energy, a conduit for fear, absence, and the residual manipulation that Lucien had orchestrated. Walls, floors, and ceilings retained subtle distortions, imperceptible shifts in alignment, objects displaced by fractions of inches, shadows curling in ways that defied natural light and physics, reinforcing the sense that reality within this space remained under the magician's command. Visitors reported an unsettling presence upon re-entry, a psychic weight pressing upon the chest, a sensation that unseen eyes observed every movement, every breath echoing the performance's psychological grip. Legends and folklore quickly intertwined with factual accounts, blurring the lines between historical record and myth. Writers, journalists, and raconteurs chronicled the vanished, crafting narratives that preserved the terror while embellishing the acts, each retelling amplifying Lucien's reputation and cementing the theater as a locus of dark fascination. Scholars debated the mechanisms: psychological conditioning, advanced optics, environmental manipulation, occult practices, but none fully reconciled the vanishings or the precise, reproducible terror that had gripped the audience. The vanished were not mere illusions. Their absence was absolute, the psychological impact permanent, a reminder of the fragility of perception and the malleability of consciousness when confronted by forces beyond comprehension. Patrons described a persistent unease, a subtle awareness that reality itself could be manipulated, that shadows might conceal more than darkness, that presence and absence were not absolutes but variables subject to the will of a master manipulator. Lucien's legacy endured in the psychological fabric of Montmartre, in whispered stories in academic studies, and in the occasional fleeting glimpse of impossible shadows, a permanent imprint on the collective psyche. The magician's influence persisted in the cityscape itself. Corners appeared darker than they should. Streets seemed to stretch and warp in peripheral vision, and faint traces of vanished individuals seemed to flicker in reflections and photographs. The psychological scars on those present were long-lasting. Sleep was troubled, perception was heightened, and an underlying tension persisted, a subtle acknowledgement that the world was no longer entirely predictable or safe. Observers described recurring encounters with the absent, brief, disorienting impressions of people who should have existed, shadows that mimicked movement and whispers that emerged from silence, all reinforcing the notion that the vanishings were not only permanent, but active, sustained by forces beyond understanding. Montmartre itself became a character in the legacy, its streets, theaters, and alleyways imbued with the memory of impossibility, a cityscape haunted by absence, shadows, and the lasting effects of Lucien Moreau's mastery. Some patrons avoided the theater entirely in subsequent years, unable to confront the lingering energy, the residual fear, and the psychological weight that continued to press upon the mind long after the performance ended. Others returned repeatedly, compelled by fascination, obsession, or a desire to confront the impossible firsthand. Each visit a testament to the enduring allure of fear intertwined with curiosity. Academics, chroniclers, and storytellers debated endlessly the ethical, psychological, and metaphysical implications, speculating whether the vanished were lost forever or trapped in a liminal state, existing in a realm simultaneously real and unreal. The magician himself became a legend, an almost mythological figure whose presence was felt through absence, whose mastery of fear and perception created a permanent scar upon reality, consciousness, and the cultural memory of Paris. Shadows remained longer than light allowed. Whispers persisted where no voice existed, and empty spaces in photographs, drawings, and memories served as a chilling reminder of the vanished and the incomprehensible acts that had removed them. Lucien Moreau's theater continued to function as both a physical location and a psychological nexus, a space where reality bent to perception, fear anchored consciousness, and absence became as tangible as presence. Patrons, witnesses, and historians alike realized that the legacy of the vanishings was not merely an anecdote or performance, but a profound demonstration of the malleability of perception, the terrifying reach of mastery over mind and matter, and the haunting consequences of encountering the impossible firsthand. Even decades later, those who had attended described fleeting sensations, shadows that responded to thought and an uncanny awareness of the vanished, confirming that the magician's influence had endured far beyond the confines of time, memory, or corporeal reality. Montmartre's streets, once mundane, carried the weight of collective memory. Every alleyway, lamppost, and shadow, a subtle reminder of Lucien Moreau's dominion over perception, reality, and fear itself. The vanished, the shadows, and the persistent presence of impossibility had become permanent elements of the city's psychological landscape, a chilling testament to the magician's dark genius and a reminder that some mysteries, once unleashed, could never be contained. The audience, transformed into witnesses and carriers of the memory, bore the responsibility of this knowledge, haunted forever by what they had seen, what they had lost, and what they could never fully understand. Lucien Moreau had not merely performed, he had reshaped reality, left a permanent mark upon consciousness, and ensured that the echoes of his mastery would endure for generations. The final act of Lucien Moreau's legacy unfolded not on stage, but in the minds of those who had borne witness to his impossible feats. The vanished remained a haunting presence, their absence an indelible imprint upon the collective consciousness of Paris. Shadows lingered where they should not, twisting and curling in ways that defied logic, as if the theater itself had absorbed a portion of the vanished, their energy persisting in the very walls. Patrons described waking moments of disorientation, fleeting glimpses of figures that should not exist, and an ever-present tension, a subtle reminder that the magician's influence had extended far beyond the confines of the performance. Scholars attempted to rationalize, to measure, to understand, yet the more meticulously they documented, the deeper the mystery seemed to grow. Defying the laws of physics, psychology, and perception, Lucien Moreau's mastery had not been merely performance. It had been an intervention upon reality itself, bending perception, space, and presence to his singular will. The vanished were remembered in photographs with empty spaces where eyes and faces should have been, their absence forming an eerie pattern, a haunting signature left upon the memories of all who had witnessed the events. The theater became a nexus, a locus where shadows, memory, and perception intertwined, creating a persistent psychological weight that imbued Montmartre with an almost imperceptible, pervasive tension. Visitors reported the sensation of being observed, of subtle movements in peripheral vision, whispers in silence, and a deep, inexplicable unease that made the ordinary streets feel charged with unseen forces. Attempts to replicate or explain the vanishings were universally unsuccessful. No magician, psychologist, or theorist could recreate the precision, consistency, or terror induced by Lucian's acts. Theories ranged from advanced psychological manipulation to contact with supernatural forces. Yet none could account for the complete extraction of presence from those who had vanished. Montmartre itself seemed altered by the events. Shadows stretched long into alleys, gas lamps flickered with an unusual persistence, and the streets carried a sense of expectation, an invisible tension that attested to the enduring influence of the magician's performance. Patrons found themselves haunted not only by memory but by perception, their senses forever attuned to anomalies, gaps, and impossibilities, the vanished existing simultaneously in absence and influence. Folklore elevated Lucien Moreau into a figure both feared and revered, a man whose mastery of fear, perception, and psychological domination blurred the line between human skill and supernatural power. The vanished became central symbols of this mythos, their absences reminders of the fragile boundaries between reality and illusion, life and disappearance, presence and void. Shadows were described as semi-sentient, responding to thought, movement, and emotion, creating a psychological environment in which the observer's mind became a participant in the lingering performance. The theater itself remained active in its residual influence, a space where reality had been permanently altered and where fear, absence, and perception continued to interplay long after the audience had departed. Patrons experienced recurring hallucinations, fleeting glimpses of vanished forms, and a subtle distortion of space, as though the very architecture remembered the acts performed within. The vanished existed as a psychological and metaphysical enigma, bound to the theater, the shadows, and the memory of those who had witnessed the events, their presence tangible in absence, an enduring testament to Lucien's mastery. Scholars and chroniclers documented these residual effects with great care, noting that even decades later, visitors described phenomena that defied rational explanation, reinforcing the notion that the magician's influence had transcended time, consciousness, and physical boundaries. Montmartre itself became a character in the legend, streets and corners imbued with the lingering presence of impossibility, a cityscape subtly warped by memory, fear, and shadow. Patrons often reported subtle auditory illusions, whispers in empty streets, faint echoes of laughter, the sensation of movement just beyond vision, all reinforcing the psychological permanence of Lucien's acts. The magician's presence was felt in the lingering dread, fascination, and obsessive curiosity of those who had experienced the performance firsthand. Even those who had never attended spoke of the legend with a tremor in their voice, a cultural echo of fear and awe, the vanished functioning as ghostly intermediaries between myth and memory. The vanished were no longer simply individuals. They had become vessels of the magician's enduring power, their absences a permanent feature of Parisian consciousness, their influence a warning, a fascination, and a horror. Lucien Moreau's artistry had transcended performance, transforming the theater into a crucible of perception, memory, and existential manipulation, embedding fear and awe into the very fabric of the city. Every shadow, every whisper, every subtle anomaly in light or space became a testament to his mastery, a reminder that some acts are so profound that they reshape reality itself, leaving witnesses, observers, and generations forever haunted. Patrons continued to recount experiences decades later, shadows moving independently, objects defying expectation, and fleeting glimpses of those who had vanished, all converging to confirm the inescapable legacy of Lucien Moreau. The magician had not only performed, he had transcended mortality, embedding a permanent presence through absence, a haunting reminder that reality is fragile, perception is malleable, and the mastery of fear and the impossible can leave an indelible mark upon time, space, and consciousness. In the end, Montmartre became inseparable from the story, a living monument to the vanished, the shadows, and the inimitable genius of Lucien Moreau, whose influence endured, whispered, and observed all who dared to witness. The vanished, the shadows, and the lingering tension of impossibility ensured that Lucien's legacy would persist, eternally entwined with the city, the memory of witnesses, and the ever-present reminder that some mysteries defy explanation, resist understanding and endure as haunting, indelible truths of human perception and fear.